Hello everyone, and welcome to another Playbuffer tutorial. This tutorial is the second one that I'm going to be doing. However, I suppose it would probably be a bit more fair to call it tutorial 1.5. This tutorial is just designed to be a little bit of a bonus video in which I'm not really going to be doing any actual coding, but instead I'm going to be talking a little bit more in depth about how Playbuffer works behind the scenes. In particular, I'm going to talk about how it stores and manages its game objects in a way that is both efficient and quite easy for us to use. So to start off with, I'm going to do something a little bit scary, but please stay with me. And I'm actually going to click on the play.h file. So the play.h file is the location of all the actual code that Playbuffer provides to us. For the purpose of this assessment and this module, I really wouldn't recommend tampering with this file, not unless you seriously know what you're doing. But sometimes if you get stuck, or if, like in this case, you just want to know a little bit more about how a function or functionality works, it can be quite useful to look at the code supplied to us, which is exactly what we're going to do here. So as I touched on in the first tutorial on spawning objects, Playbuffer uses a system of object IDs in order to store and access its game objects. The idea being that each object has its own distinct ID, and that using this we can reach our distinct object at any given time. The system it uses for this is the main reason we're all here, but really quickly, let's just take a quick peek at exactly how it assigns these objects their IDs first. So I'm going to search for game objects using Control F, and I'm going to find this struct here, game object. So this is a game object. As you can see, there are quite a lot of variables here, but I don't really want to focus too much on any of these. Instead, I want to focus, if I come down a bit, on this function here, which is the initialization function. So I'm going to right click on this and go to definition so I can take a look. As you can see here, there's a lot of assignments here like you might expect when you're creating a game object, but there's also these two lines of code here, which is what we want to look at in terms of unique IDs. So in the first line, we have the creation of a new variable, unique ID, and in the second line, we add one to the counter and then set the object's ID equal to that counter. This is very simple, but the important thing to note here, and the thing that you may not have seen before, is this use of the keyword static here. Now, what static means is that it's basically just going to stay across the lifespan of our game. So if you didn't have this, then every time this function was called, it would make a new unique ID variable and set it equal to 0. But because we have the keyword static, every time this function is called, it's just going to go to the same unique ID and keep the count consistent. And what this is going to mean between the two is that the first game object you get, you're going to make this thing at 0, and then add 1 to it, and then set the first game object's ID to 1, and then the next time unique ID is already going to be 1, so when you add 1 to it, it'll become 2, and the second object that you make will have the ID of 2. Perfect, so that's how we assign, or not we, but that's how Playbuffer assigns its IDs. So now we need to think about our next problem, which is how we actually store and retrieve these objects. So I want to take a quick look at create game object, which is a function we used during the first tutorial. And in this function, there's quite a lot of stuff that we don't really care about, but this second last line here is quite interesting. So this is where it basically takes what we have, or what we've done here to initialize and create our game object, and inserts it into something called an object map. So a map is something you may or may not have seen before. If you've encountered dictionaries, it's basically the same thing, or at least very similar. But what it is, in simple terms, is just a collection of pairs of data. So normally there's a key and there's a value. And you can see actually in here the key and the value. So in this case, our key is an integer, which is object ID in this case. And our value is a reference to a game object, so our game object. So we just end up with pairs of object ID, game object. Using a map has quite a lot of benefits, but the simplest way to explain why we use a map is just because it makes everything really easy. If you come down here and you look at get game object using the ID, all we have to do is just iterate over our map and check each of the IDs, and then when we have a match, we return the object that we match to. And that's basically it. It's a very simple system. This was hopefully quite a short tutorial, but the way in which Playbuffer uses this map with its key pair values is incredibly flexible and useful across a huge number of projects. Anytime you want to store a big list of anything with identifiers and access them easily, a map or a dictionary, depending on what language you're supposed to be using, is probably the way to go. So thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.